About to leave, already packing. Come with me, I'm not really asking. We'll get away to a place where we don't know. About to see the world in action, what we can be, life with no distractions. We'll get away, this is what we waited for. Take my hand, we'll make it somehow. We can't miss out. I'm done living life with the lights out. Die with my own doubts. Be free with me. Let's be free with Not looking back, eyes on the freeway, Bonnie and Clyde, a classic cliche. We're on the run, this is what we waited for. Take my hand, we'll make it somehow. We can't miss out. I'm done living life with the lights out. Die with my own doubts. Be free.
By a whole grade.
I've improved.
By a whole grade.
By a whole grade.
By a whole grade.
My teacher isn't just Mr. Maddock. It's a whole teaching team made up of James, Mike and Marta.
My classroom's all about doing and applying. My days standing at the front of the classroom with a PowerPoint are long gone.
I master every concept by learning at my own pace.
I spend 100% of my class time interacting and supporting individual students.
I move on only when the moment is right for me, not the whole class.
I know what each and every student is mastering and struggling on at every moment.
I know exactly what I need to learn next, and I can go back and review material at any time.
I spend my teaching time supporting and inspiring, not planning, delivering and marking.
I can learn from anywhere at any time.
I can switch off when school closes, knowing they are learning from the best.
My teacher has my homework marked before I get to class.
I set every piece of homework at the start of the year.
I'm 2 weeks ahead of my expected progress.
I can track everyone's progress with a swipe of a finger.
I can track my own progress and set my own targets.
I now have time to focus on developing the skills of every learner in my classroom.
I know exactly what it means to explain, evaluate and analyse, and I'm not afraid of any exam.
My lessons are now far more about the skills and the application, not just the content itself.
I've completely remodeled what it means to be a teacher in my classroom.
Good afternoon, one and all. It is Monday, the 14th of May. It is about 1 minute to 4. and we have the 6th of our 6 sessions on GCSE preparation. We're going to do some stuff on sports psychology. It kind of touches on the skill acquisition as well, to be honest. And I hope you've got your notes pages available. You should have them downloaded. You should have them in front of you. If you're watching this live, then you're in a classroom. Hopefully your teacher has passed those on to you already. If you are watching this on demand afterwards, the notes pages are in the description just down there. Just have a little look and you can download those and you can follow along with the show. There are 2 main teaching elements in the show this afternoon, both of which we're going to cover in detail, some skill-based exam work. So it's important you have the notes to be able to go along with that. Let me remind you of a couple of things before we get started. Thing number 1, okay, please subscribe to the YouTube channel. Many of you have been doing that. We would really like you to keep doing it. It's super important to us. We're trying very hard to build up the prominence of that YouTube channel, and we really need your support to do it. So it costs you nothing. Please subscribe to us just there. It would be really appreciated. We've got some unreal stuff that we're going to be putting out via this YouTube channel very, very soon, so we need your support. Secondly, DVR is switched on for this live show. So what does that mean? That means that if you're in a classroom or if you're on your own, you're watching this from home, whatever, you can pause the live stream and you can push it back to watch something which you want me to clarify again for you, want to repeat, or you miss something. You can go backwards and use the DVR that way. What that might mean is you finish slightly in the live stream for everybody else, but that's absolutely fine. You can always drag forward if you need to later on. The only thing you can't do is drag into the future because, of course, this is live. Now, all that being said, we've got another person in the studio today. Marta's with us, controlling the stream for us.
Hello, good afternoon.
And Marta, could you just quickly show our visitors and friends how they can interact with us this afternoon, please?
Of course I can.
Marta, are you sure we got sound going out? Yeah? Okay, great. Yeah, I can see the sound bouncing. So yeah, so the question is right. We'll get Mike to quickly change the title of that in a moment, okay? So, good stuff.
Yes, we did. We didn't have sound.
Okay.
While we were showing that.
Let me repeat that. I thought something had gone wrong there. I had a little feeling.
Yeah, I haven't got sound yet.
But you got sound back on me. I'm on the camera, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so what we just showed you on the screen there, apologies if our sound went out for a moment. So what that was to say is that you can interact with us by answering that question by going to the EverLearner.com, hitting the button News, and going down to GCSE session 6 and submitting your answer to us. We read them all and we publish those that we think are really, really cool. So we really do want to get your answers in there. So do please submit them. Teachers, get your students answering, please. Okay. That's one thing. The second thing is we would like to know what you're doing in your revision break. So ever so quickly, I think Marta's going to quickly show you how you can interact with us via Twitter, Facebook and Instagram. If you're able to, you just need to submit to us a photo of something you're doing in your revision break and we will put it into the stream, especially if it kind of makes us laugh a little bit. We like things like that. Just be aware that we can only publish things, we can only put things in the stream where we believe that you've got everyone's permission in the photo to be in the photo. So all that being understood, we'd like to get your photos into the stream and do that way. Now, final things, there will be volume changes within the live stream today. So if you're on a live stream, you may need to turn up and down your volume at different parts. We tend to find in general, I mean, maybe you find it different. We tend to find in general that the live teaching element bits are a bit louder than this bit when I'm using these microphones. So you might actually find you want to turn it down in the moment rather than up and up when we come back to the studio. So just be aware of that. It's just because we switch between microphones when we're doing different things. And I think, therefore, Marta, we are ready to go on a little bit of mental preparation. I'll tell you what I was going to say to you guys. I will make a point in these episodes of telling you about your exam board. So make sure you're listening to what I say about when it's relevant to your exam board and when it's not. I'm going to detail that in both parts of this, okay? So when we're doing mental preparation stuff and later on when we're doing the feedback stuff, because the overlap is crazy. It's kind of overlapping and kind of not, and I'll explain that to you as we go, okay? So make sure you understand that and make sure you know what exam board you are on. Okay, so I think I'm ready, Marta. You ready?
I'm ready, yes.
Okay, so as soon as you're ready, let's go.
Okay, so mental preparation. Now, oddly, the first thing I'm going to do with our mental preparation session is I'm going to talk about something which we predominantly think about as a physical idea, and that is the idea of a warm-up. Now, while you may not look at your mental preparation section of your textbook, or for the case of you AQA guys, you might want to look at arousal and arousal control. The warm-up, of course, is not just a physical, but it's also a psychological process. So I want to remind you of a couple of things about mental preparation and a warm-up. Okay, well, first of all, we often have, depending on what sport it is, we often have some notion of a team talk, okay? Now, of course, that might not apply to Josh directly in his sprinting, more of which in a second. It's also, get ready for this one, see how many of you get this within your warm-up. It's time for quiet thought. Okay, now, if we build a warm-up effectively, it allows individuals, even within team scenarios, to have quiet reflection time and thinking time in preparation for what they're about to do. There's also a relaxation process in the sense that it is time to socialize, which can prevent negative thoughts and can allow athletes to feel more relaxed, more comfortable in their sort of social zone at the right moment. And of course, the other point is that it improves. It's a good physical warm-up, I should say. Good physical warm-up actually improves our psychology, and it's what we call the physical to cognitive connection. The physical to cognitive meaning thinking, the physical to cognitive connection. So by preparing properly, and this would include days and weeks before as the same idea. Now, if we're physically fit, if our skills have been well developed, then our tendency to have good psychology is obviously much higher. And it's the same with the warm-up. Now, we also have things like calm discussion of goals. Okay, we emphasize the word calm there, calm discussion of goals. Okay, that is clearly a psychological process. Use the words targets instead of goals if you prefer. And we also have the use of what we'd call performance goals. Focusing the individual on aspects of their performance that are going to impact the quality of what they're about to do, rather than focus on we need to win today. We would focus on performance goals, which is getting our tactics right, getting our structure right, getting our strategy right, getting our positioning, whatever, getting those things correct, getting our technique right. That getting those things correct, of course, leads to more tendency. Now, I just mentioned this warm-up factor because so many of you need to think about warm-up not just as a physical but as a psychological preparation factor when you look at that topic. Now, we haven't looked in detail at warm-up and cool-down within this revision section, but I just wanted to mention it in here because I do think it's important for you guys as well. Just reflect on that. Now, what I do want to do now is I want to focus on Josh. Now, Josh is over here. He's a bit of a legend. Here he is, old Josh. He's a good sprinter. He's a young man, but looks older, and he's very, very good at running. Okay, but we want to specifically know what mental preparation techniques should he be considering with regard to his psychological and mental preparation. Now, I'm going to go through basically a bit of a list, and let me remind you that if you are an AQA student, where this becomes interesting for you guys is controlling arousal. Okay, so you probably want to learn this in relation to a topic that you study, which is called controlling arousal. For everybody else, well, certainly for EdXL OCR and WJC, you want to think about this as mental preparation, okay? But just so you guys in there, AQA, just so you're aware, you just need to think about that with regard to controlling arousal. Now, all that being said, let's get on with it. So first of all, I want to bring your attention to what we might call imagery. Now, for Josh, I think it's fair to say imagery is very likely to happen pre-performance, okay? Pre-performance. Now, the reason that is because his performance is so rapid and it's going to be over so quickly, and he's focusing so hard on the physical aspects of his performance that a lot of the psychological aspects are going to come pre-performance. Now, bear in mind, for other performers, let's take something like a rugby goal kicker, or a goalkeeper preparing to save a penalty. These processes could well happen during performance or just prior to a moment during performance, okay? So we're talking about Josh here, but there's no reason why these can't be mid-performance for other athletes, all right? So let's think about it in that way. Now, a couple of things first of all. When we talk about imagery, we are talking about imagined pictures. Okay, now that doesn't give a lot away to begin with, and we're going to sort of develop this out, but we're talking about imagined pictures. We are talking about the process, and I'm going to go further with this in a moment. We're talking about the process of mental rehearsal, more of which in a second. Okay, mental rehearsal. We are talking about the process of either what we would call internal imagery. Internal imagery. Okay, internal imagery is a very interesting concept. Okay, it's what we would describe as actually picturing oneself doing. So it's what we call doing the performance. So, in this case, Josh would picture himself getting a great sprint start, getting his pickup just right, and so on, and dipping at the line. So it's picturing ourselves doing. It's very much related to feelings of the skill. What does it actually feel like? And it's very much related to movements, okay? So what would those movements actually feel like? And you often see when people are undertaking internal imagery that they'll actually move, they'll actually perform an aspect of their performance which relates to the movement of which they are visualizing. So just bear in mind we call that internal imagery. Now we also want to have an awareness of what we call external imagery. External imagery. Okay, now external images is a slightly different concept. It's where the performer will picture, it's where they'll picture from outside. So you could think about this almost like Josh, for example, imagining his performance on a video. Okay, he's imagining watching himself. Okay, and that would be what we'd call external imagery. There are other forms of imagery where we do external imagery. We imagine someone else performing, for example. I'm not going to get into that now, but there are those methodologies as well. Now, I also want to sort of say about imagery, I think it's really important we get this point, and I've touched on it already. It's what we'd call a multi-sensory experience. So look what I've just said there. You develop the feelings of the movement. You develop sort of emotional feelings and the feelings of the skill. You actually, in this sense, you've obviously got the visual stimulus. We've actually got the multi-sensory aspect of this. And of course, people will also imagine the sounds that they're going to hear. In Josh's case, maybe that first ripple of the bee of the bang, for example. They would imagine that. So we'd call this a multi-sensory experience. We'd also say about imagery that it increases confidence, okay? So it is a process which is going to help Josh or an equivalent athlete feel more confident in their performance. It also reduces what we'd call anxiety. Remember, anxiety is things like worry and apprehension and negative thinking, more of which in a few moments' time. And let me just draw down here. It increases concentration, okay? Now, a couple of things I want to add to this. Okay, a couple of things I want to add to this. When we talk about imagery, I've just focused very much on what is the technique aspect of the performance. So I've just focused very much on what is the technique aspect of the performance, actually how it feels. And we'd actually summarize all of that as mental rehearsal. Okay, but just so you know, there is a way of visualizing where we just focus on relaxation. Okay, we visualize something which is completely non-stressful, even completely separate and not related to the sporting performance at all. Okay, we picture this relaxing environment so we can switch off from the stress and the concern of the impending performance, which perhaps is very, very meaningful. Okay, so we've got this different notion. So just be aware that, of course, mental rehearsal in this sense, we talk about it performance or technique based. It's that mental rehearsal preparation of the performance itself. But just be aware that visualization can include non-performance related imagery. Okay, so imagery, visualization, which is non-performance related, which is related to relaxation. So it's important just to remember that, because it's a different factor that we don't often talk about. Now, I also want to talk to you about the notion of self-talk. Now, you may have been told from a very young age that the first sign of madness is talking to oneself. Well, it turns out that was not a very reliable piece of information, because self-talk is a really, really, really positive experience for promoting high quality sporting performance, assuming that all of the physical stuff has been done well. So with positive self-talk, what are we talking about here? We are talking about a process that promotes positive thinking and feelings. Positive thinking and feelings. Now, first of all, realise that positive self-talk and imagery can happen in combination with one another. Okay, so we sometimes refer to positive self-talk as a mantra. A mantra is always repeated. And it's important to remember that self-talk is going to be some kind of repetitive affirmation. I really like the word affirmation in this context. Affirmation basically means it's positive. The simplest of simple examples would be, I can do this. I can do this. I am. Someone might repeat themselves over and over again. I've prepared hard for this event. I'm ready. I've prepared hard for this event. I'm ready. I'm ready. I'm ready. These positive self-talks or affirmations are going to promote this idea of positive thinking and positive feeling. Now, what we want to also address here is that self-talk can be negative, or it can become negative. And I would hazard a guess that all of you would have experienced this at some point. And when we say it can become negative, what we want to do with self-talk is we want to prevent it. So it needs preventing. Okay, so we're looking to prevent this negative self-talk, and we do this through a process that we refer to as thought stopping. Now, it seems very blunt as a process, but we are literally saying here that if Josh has in his mind, sorry for drawing on your forehead, Josh, but if Josh has in his mind this worry or apprehension or negative thinking which enters his mind, he completely ignores it. He prevents it from entering his kind of processing of information. Okay, so he completely ignores that negative thought, and he returns presumably to this affirmation that's repetitive and mantra-based, which promotes positive thinking and feeling. I'm ready. I'm ready for this. I've prepared well. I'm going to get the perfect start. These sorts of affirmative, positive self-commentary. And of course, this often comes down to like habit and tendency, if we're more likely to do this or less. Now, a couple of other points I want to focus on with you. I want to talk a little bit about the notion of, let me use that colour. I want to talk a little bit about the notion of selective attention. Those of you that study something like basic information processing will already know a lot about this, I'm sure. But with selective attention, what we're saying here is that we focus attention on only key factors. Okay, so in other words, we only focus attention on key factors, and we call those key factors relevant stimuli. Okay, so let's have a think about that. Josh might be lining up on the start line, and is there any point in him, does it affect his performance in any way, does it promote his performance in any way, to look at the person in the lane next to him and think something like, they look like they're going to run fast today? No, it doesn't make any difference to their performance whatsoever. It will not reduce their time whatsoever that they're looking to run. So you just ignore that stuff. We sometimes call it tunnel vision or blocking things out, and we're going to call it here selective attention. So we're also talking here, we're not just focusing on the relevant, we're going to ignore, or let's call it filter out, irrelevant information. Okay? So, an example of irrelevant information in sprinting is the runner next to you. It's meaningless. It doesn't matter. The only performance factors are the timing of the gun going off and the quality and the speed of your running technique. Nothing else influences that performance. Okay, so on that basis, we can filter everything else out. Now, of course, that does vary from performance to performance. In many sports, you have to be very focused on your opponents. Team games would be an example. I like to describe selective attention in the following way. It helps us to reduce noise from the environment. Now, I don't literally mean noise, or it could be. I'm talking about stuff in the environment which doesn't matter to performance, okay? It doesn't matter. We filter it out. We block it out. The other thing I'd say about selective attention, it is a skill. It takes time to develop the tendency to do this. So if you think about it, we need to know what's relevant in order to filter the other stuff out. And, of course, we need to actually learn how to do it. So selective attention is a skill, and it does take time. And you'll often find with younger performers, inexperienced performers, it will take them longer in order to identify and then actually correctly remove those things. Okay, so that's all of the information I want to sort of go over. Let's have a little look at some questions. I left myself a lot of space. Here we go. Let me just put this in the middle. Nice. Okay, a bit more space. I'm being asked to describe. Now, when we're describing something, we often say what it is. We often say is characterized by. It's characterized by. We often say is like. We often say is not, when we say it's not or it's not like, whatever. And we often say is composed of. And if you look at those linguistic sort of, those kind of useful linguistics there, what we're saying there is we're simply giving the characteristics or the details of something. We're not saying why. We're not saying how. We're not saying anything about explaining, we're simply describing it. And what the other thing I draw out here is I'm describing two mental processes. So in other words, I have to choose two and write in detail about two, and in this case, enough to get 6 marks. Now I think this would be a tough question in your exam, amongst the toughest you get if you were, what was that? If you would get this particular question here. But we're going to describe two mental processes that Josh could use prior to race, so it's before the race, to improve his chances of winning. Okay, so let's have a little look at what we talk about here. Big answer, but let's take our time. The first is, notice the language, positive self-talk. Okay, so I'm going to get a mark there, which is characterized by repeated affirmations or mantras. Okay, so I might get a mark for affirmations. There's my 2 extra. I've probably now got a sub-max. Okay, because I've got 3 marks for the first one of those 2. Notice here, what have I simply done? I've said what it is and is characterized by. And that's all you have to do in a described question. It's all you have to do. So self-talk also includes blocking negative thoughts. Maybe I would get some marks for this if I hadn't before, such as apprehension and worry or doubt. The second is imagery, okay, which is characterized by creating visual images of success or good technique. Okay, maybe I get my marks there and I get to my max. And I've also said, or relaxation. Imagery helps to increase confidence and reduce anxiety. Okay, so I'm saying what this thing is and what it's characterized by. I'm not saying why, I'm not saying how it's done. I'm simply describing the concept. Let's move on. By the way, on these questions, you do need to return to these. If you're in the live show, even if you're in a classroom, you can pause and drag this back and take some time looking at the characteristics of that answer if you choose, because we've got the DVR on the live show, so you can do that if you want to. But let's move on. Now I've got a different command. Now I'm being asked to explain why. When we're asked to explain why, we're going to be talking about things such as because, therefore, comma, this means. You can also have things like as a result. These are classic. This causes. These are classic things for explaining why. Explain why Josh might use visualization during training and before he competes. Okay, so let's have a little look at what we've got. This is because, notice I'm explaining why, it reduces anxiety. How many marks am I looking for? 3. Increases confidence and promotes a sense of relaxation. Okay, I'm probably done with that single sentence. Okay, but let's see what else we've got. We've got here, therefore, comma, I'm explaining, I'm making sure I get my knowledge down. The tendency for best performance increases. And isn't that ultimately what it's about? The tendency for best performance increases, because ultimately that's why you would use visualization, because it promotes the possibility of best performance within the competition. So we're explaining, just notice the difference between explaining why and describing characteristics. Is this, is that. Explaining why, it happens because, therefore this means. And those are the differences we really want you guys to sharpen up on with regard to these sort of exam-based skills in preparation for your exam.
we're back now. We're back now. I was too early. So, good. Let's go for some questions, please, Marta.
Right, so James, I've got one question about self-talk.
Mm-hmm.
Could you please tell me, what would self-talk look like if I was doing, for example, gymnastics? What would it look like?
Well, I think the first thing is that we need it to be affirming or an affirmation, so it has to come in that positive frame. Okay, so let me think of a good example for a gymnast. For some reason, I'm thinking about a gymnast on a beam. It might be because we're interviewing Olympic gymnast Becky Wing on Wednesday for the Teacher in Classroom 21 podcast. Wow, looking forward to that. Just happens to be an Olympic gymnast and happens to have gone and studied business at Stanford University. Kind of excited to talk to her. Nevertheless, so something for a gymnast. I would suggest something along the lines of a beam performer repeating. It would be to herself, of course, because beam is for females only. She would be repeating to herself some affirmation such as, I will keep my head still in this rotation or in this somersault. Or it could be, I have a firm balance of my feet on the beam, repeating those affirmative. They're kind of technique-based factors. It could be something as simple as saying, I've prepared effectively for this moment and I'm ready. I'm ready. I'm ready. I've prepared effectively. I'm ready. And the whole idea of that is it promotes the idea of that positive affirmation being more likely to happen, to have a positive outcome, because the psychological profile is in the positive. Now, those of you that are going to go in the future, it switches people out of what we call like a fear or a failure avoidance model into a trying to achieve success model, and that's ultimately what positive self-talk does. And it's much more powerful to try and achieve something rather than trying to avoid failing at something. Okay, you can use both in combination, but broadly speaking, that is the case. There'll be individual people who that differs for, of course. We're not talking about everybody, but broadly speaking.
I was just going to say, could it be the case where if you're trying to avoid something, you're thinking of that thing you're trying to avoid, isn't it? Is it that you're visualizing the failure rather than...
Yeah. Okay, so I think this just tips us over the edge of going off the specifications here. But what I would say to young people that is very useful for you in your exam series in general is that your imagination or your subconscious does not know the difference between reality and imagined reality. Secondly, it does not recognize the negative. So if you think through things such as, I don't want X, Y, Z, I don't want to fail, I don't want to know nothing, I don't want to go blank in my exam, I don't want to go blank in my exam, the chances of that then occurring will increase as a result of you following that psychological pathway and thinking through those behaviors as possibilities, because your subconscious does not recognize the negative. It only sees the concept, the object, in this case going blank in an exam, and therefore as that's in your mind, it's more likely to come out. So a much better way of doing it is to say, I will be full of thoughts and ideas in my exam. I will be full of thoughts and ideas in my exam. It's a much more powerful way of thinking, even though it actually contains the same principle at the heart of it. That's why people who want to quit smoking, for example, might find it more difficult than someone who says, I want to be smoke free. I'm going to be smoke free. Okay, it's a different mentality. It's a mental switch, and it's quite effective. And that's why positive self-talk does work. But repeat what I said in the teaching element there. It's also necessary to switch off or block the negative thinking, and we call that negative thought stopping. And that's a literal description. We're literally saying we're not going to let that idea enter our mind. And if it does enter our mind, we're just going to let it drift away, and we're going to completely ignore it. We're going to selectively attend it away. So yeah.
Interesting. And then I use the word visualization, or to visualize. Is the word imagery the same?
Yes. Yeah, effectively the same concept. So visualization and imagery, of course, involves visualizations of things. So yeah, they're synonymous terms. You can use either. Certainly, you could perfectly expect a question to ask you about visualization or ask you about imagery, and you probably should look for either and both of those terms within your questions. And you certainly should feel comfortable writing those terms in your answers too.
Great. And also, just now you were also telling us, you were explaining about selective attention. Could you tell me how, because you've mentioned about selective attention for a runner, how does selective attention vary from sport to sport?
Okay, so selective attention, first of all, if on your course you're studying information processing, you need to know more about this, okay? So selective attention is what we call a perceptual process. You take everything that's around you, all of that display, all of that environment, all of that information, and as well as the feeling of movement that you have intrinsically, more of which in a moment, internally. And effectively what you do there is you switch on your focus to those things that affect your performance and switch off your focus of those things that don't affect your performance. Now, I'm not literally talking about noise here, but from all of the noise, all of the things around you, which we can just generally call kind of the white noise, it's the idea of pinpointing that thing, which is, or number of things, which is relevant to the performance. So if we look at different skills, if we look at something like a closed skill, such as sprinting, javelin throwing, gymnastics routine, something like that, and then we look at something like an open performance, such as games playing, for example, when we talk about selective attention, you have to attend to, or you have to notice, you have to focus on in games a much wider field of objects and ideas and things, because the game is so changeable, it changes all the time. Whereas with our javelin throwing say you focus entirely on your internal processes, you focus entirely on your technique, and nothing external actually has an impact on your performance. In the game, where the opponent is, impacts your performance. So you have to focus and you have to keep your attention on that. So it's a much broader focus in something like an open skill. It's a much narrower focus and a much narrower selection in something like a closed skill like javelin throwing. We call that the perceptual field, if anybody's interested.
Brilliant.
Yeah.
Okay,
so,
great.
Any photos and things?
We do have a photo,
I can't
yes.
wait.
Matt has sent us
wow.
a fantastic picture of himself doing some revision. I love his family photos over there.
Oh yeah, look at that.
Yeah.
Is that Matt in the back? Is that a photo of a young Matt in the back? It looks.
Possibly.
I think that photo's. I don't think he's old enough to be in that photo. I could be wrong. That photo looks older.
Or it's been in the sun for a long time.
Or it's bleached. That's also a possibility. Well, Matt, thank you for sharing your photo. I never know what that little phone handy thing means completely, but I appreciate it. Yeah. Okay, good.
Cool.
And Marta, we did want to show people, especially all teachers and students, we'd really encourage you, if you show them this now, are you able to show them that, Marta?
Oh, hold on. Yep, sorry.
One of the things we're preparing for you, and we reckon it'll be launched within about 45 minutes at the end of this show, we're preparing a video on YouTube, which is the entire teaching elements that we've done in these 6 revision shows, all sort of structured together in a single video broadcast. Okay, and if you look as well in the description there that Marta's showing you, you'll see we've also broken it down into all of the different elements in there as well. So we'll be launching that at the end of this live show. About 45 minutes after this live show, you'll be able to go to our YouTube channel and have a look at that, and notice that the notes pages again are in the description. So that's hopefully going to be really useful for people to go straight to the content they want in this last couple of days before at least paper 1, if not paper 2. Only some of you doing different exam boards are doing paper 1, and others only some of you are doing 2 exam papers for GCSE PE, others are doing just 1 paper. Okay, so if that annoys you a little bit, then it's not much I can do about that one, but it's just the case with some of the exam boards. Okay, Marta, I think we should probably move on, in my opinion. Mm-hmm. Are you ready for us to go?
Yep.
Okay, I'm ready too. Let's go.
Okay.
Okay, let's have a little look at feedback. And I've forgotten to put my other headphones in, so let me quickly do that. Hang on a second. There we go. Need to be able to hear the feedback myself, you know. So on this feedback, this is kind of where the fun starts. Okay, so I've got to show you a little bit of mad preparation that I've done ready for this. I'm going to go through all forms of feedback with you now. Okay. But you guys have to look at that list in quite a bit of detail, not least because it's in my scrawny handwriting. So look, what I've sort of stated here is that if you're an AQA student, you need to focus now on positive feedback, negative feedback, knowledge of results, knowledge of performance. If you're with EdExcel, you need to focus on intrinsic, extrinsic, concurrent, and terminal. If you're with OCR, you need to do intrinsic, extrinsic, knowledge of results, knowledge of performance, positive and negative. In other words, you guys nearly have a full house. And if you're on WJC or the EDUCAS board, you're looking at knowledge of results and knowledge of performance only. Now, I'm going to go through all of these methodologies. You guys obviously need to pick out the ones which are important to you and the ones that you're likely to be questioned on. Okay, let me be clear, that is your responsibility, not mine. I'm going to go through all of it and you're going to pick out the bits which matter to you. So make sure you focus back. I will relate back to these things as we go. So that being said, let's get on with it. And we've got our tennis player here. He's a bit of a novice. He needs to learn, he needs to improve. And first of all, I want to focus on extrinsic, and intrinsic feedback. Okay, so extrinsic and intrinsic feedback. Again, just reminding you what I said before. This therefore relates to EdXL students, to OCR students. So you guys need to be switched on at this point. So what do we mean by extrinsic feedback? So the first thing I would say to you about this is it's information coming from outside. Okay, so it's coming from outside, and the way I like to word this is from an outside source. Okay, OURCE, of course, from an outside source. So this is going to be things like coaching points. Okay, so if we have our tennis player athlete Joe here, and he is receiving coaching points from an experienced tennis coach, such as this is the correct foot position, this is the correct elbow angle, this is how you stand, this is how I want you to toss the ball, etc., etc., etc. That is going to be a characteristic of extrinsic feedback. Now, coaching points often come prior to performance, but they also come in the form of feedback on trial attempts. So what we mean by that is that the coach might say to Joe, good effort, which we're going to talk about as positive feedback in a second. But what I want you to do is I want you to change your foot position, and this is the foot position I want. Okay, that would be a classic example of extrinsic feedback in the form of coaching points. Now, the other thing you might want to think about with extrinsic feedback is it can come in the form of teammate feedback. Okay, so a teammate who perhaps you're in a hockey match or something like that, or you're playing doubles badminton or something similar, and your teammate asks something of you, perhaps in terms of strategy. Move more to your right, raise your racket, right, you defend the back, whatever. That's going to be sort of a form of extrinsic feedback as well, which is informing you of the quality, in this case, of your performance. But don't forget, a lot of what we want to focus on here is the quality and the feedback during the learning cycle. In other words, a teammate might give you feedback during some kind of practice scenario. And finally, we describe extrinsic feedback as what we would call environmental. Don't forget the N, environmental. It's because it's external, because it's outside source, it is an environmental form of feedback. So what does that mean? Well, we can structure the environment to make sure that the athlete gets the best possible extrinsic feedback that's going to cause them to learn. What would be a classic example of that? Working one-to-one with a really high qualified, excellent coach. Why is that going to work? Because they're going to be available as an extrinsic outside source of information, but or as well as they've also got high quality information to share and to correct. Now, intrinsic feedback tends to be, or is a little bit different. First of all, it's from the performer. Okay, so intrinsic feedback comes from an internal source. We often refer to it as the feeling of the skill. Okay, so what does the skill feel like? Does it feel correct? Now, you'll know from playing whatever sports that you play, you will know when the grip feels right, or your stance or your balance feels right. It's that classic feeling, is I'm in balance or not. You will know, for example, that you made good contact with a ball, say, and you'll have these sort of intrinsic internal feelings. But remember, in order to have that, you have to have experience of having done it correctly a number of times in order to recognize the correctness of what you're doing. So we can refer to this as what we describe as kinesthetic. Okay, so kinesthetic means that it's based on the feeling of the skill. So let's just tick off what we've done. We've done internal, external for you EdXL and OCR bods. Let's move things on. I'm now going to finish off EdXL because I'm going to talk here about concurrent. And you EdXL guys, you can switch off until we do the questions in a moment. Concurrent and terminal. Okay, so concurrent and terminal sounds like some of the more complex stuff. Let's go through it. So for concurrent, we're saying that it's feedback during performance. Concurrent is another word for meanwhile, as it happens. So it's feedback that comes during performance, and it's what we'd call an immediate response. Okay, so let me give you a classic example, which would be both concurrent and actually intrinsic. I'm on a slope and I'm skiing or I'm boarding or whatever, and I feel out of balance, so I adjust my position. That is a form of concurrent concurrent feedback, that I'm feeling out of balance, so I adjust my performance. And of course, in this case, it's also intrinsic. So notice how these combine. Must have an E. So let me write on here, it's often internal, although not always. It's often internal, but not always. And a great example is the one I just gave now, things like balance or what we'd call equilibrium. Okay, am I in a balanced position or not, and do I need to adjust my performance? I often think about concurrent as the need to make adjustments. Okay, so we need to make, that's an M, an E, an N, a T, and an S. So we need to make adjustments sometimes in performance, and concurrent allows us to do that. Now, terminal feedback is a very different, or really, it's the contrary, the opposite. It comes in the form of the end of performance. Okay, so at the end of performance, we get feedback on how that performance went. So a kind of a real base and simple example is, did we win or lose? Okay, that is terminal feedback on the performance quality and how it went. We can also think about something like racket sports. Did the ball, shuttle, whatever, did it go in or out? This is terminal feedback. Think about a basketballer or a netballer shooting for the net, or a footballer or a rugby player kicking for the goal. It's shooting, in other words, or taking penalties. Did it go in or out? Did I score or not? This is terminal feedback. So therefore, it's what we'd call result-based feedback. And of course, if you think about it in that way, if you do take 10 basketball set shots and you miss 9 of them, I guess ultimately you're likely to change something based on that feedback, right? I got 9 out of 10. Therefore, maybe I should change something. I need to change my technique. Is that when we start working with the coach and developing some extrinsic feedback in the form of coaching points? So this terminal feedback is at the end of performance. So where are we? Let's tick off again. We've got concurrent for Edexcel, terminal for Edexcel, ticked off. Let me just turn over my page. Bear with me a second, folks. So we also now want to, and I'll do positive and negative last. We now want to look at the ideas. We now want to look at the ideas of knowledge of results. Knowledge of results, and here I'm going to look at knowledge of performance. Now, in many ways, these deeply overlap with the concept of concurrent and terminal knowledge of performance. So let's go through these, and let's remind ourselves that for KOP and KOR, we are looking here at OCR, we are looking at WJC, EDUCAS, and we're looking at AQA, all three of you here. So the only ones that don't need to focus here are the Edexcel guys, but learn it, right? It links to your concurrent and terminal. So knowledge of results. So knowledge of results is factual, okay? It's hard facts. It's actually win, lose, in, out. Did I score or not? These are factual outcomes. What was the outcome? What was the outcome? So it's not going to take many of you a stretch to realize this is very closely related to the concept of terminal feedback I just talked about. What was the outcome? And we tend to think about it in things like this. It's things like times. These would be classic examples for athletics, swimming, triathlon, whatever. Times, distances. Let me also say in, out. And we could also put win, lose. Okay, so this again is a form of, at the end of performance, what was the overall factual outcome of the performance? And it's a concept of knowledge of results. So of course, if someone's getting, let me think of an example. If a tennis player is over the course of 3 matches is only hitting 40% first serves in, that's a knowledge of results, and therefore, obviously, we're going to have a look at something like changing that technique or doing something about it. Now, knowledge of performance is something different. How well did performance go? How well did performance go is the question we're asking there. And we're asking as well, or the point we want to make is that this is technique based. Okay, so knowledge of performance could well be something like a performance indicator. A performance indicator. Okay, performance indicator. So let's go back to our tennis server a second. That the elbow angle was in the correct position on each strike that they made in the tennis serving practice. This would be a performance indicator. Whether it went in or not would be the knowledge of results. But the actual performance indicator is the technique of that skill. And by the way, knowledge of performance is often based on the feeling of the performance. Was it correct or not? So it's very closely related to this kinesthetic intrinsic feedback as well. So that's what we mean by knowledge of results. Sorry, knowledge of performance, I should say. There's our KOR, KOR, KOP. Those ones. And the last ones we're going to look at here are positive and negative for you AQA guys. So with positive, and it's hard for me to understand why don't look at this, everybody, but never mind. So positive and negative, okay? Positive and negative. So positive and negative. So we need to look at, in terms of positive feedback, that is, what was correct. Okay, that information is what we'd call positive feedback, informing the performer of what was correct about the performance, whether it's outcome-based or performance-based. We're also looking to reinforce. Now, of course, if we reinforce those things that are correct, those things are much more likely to happen again in the future. Okay, so we reinforce correctness, and this makes it more likely that they're going to happen in the future. And they are going to motivate people as well. They're going to motivate people. So the motivational factor comes from positive feedback. Now, don't forget that positive feedback can be both emotion-based, such as praise, and it can also be information-based, okay, such as your technique was correct because. Okay, so it can be praise or emotion-based, or we sometimes call it affective, but it can also be information-based. Your technique was correct because. On the negative side, we tend to think about this as information on errors. Okay, so we get criticism or we get feedback on the things that we've done wrong. So it's a critical process for something like error detection. So make sure you include that term in your answer. And it's also what we call the basis for improvement plans. Okay, so if a coach points out to an athlete, look, we've got the completely wrong hip position on the takeoff in the long jump, then of course that's negative feedback, but it gives a basis for what's going to be worked on next. We're going to work on that hip position. Okay, so that's going to be the basis of this. So it's very closely related to error detection. And what follows error detection? Error correction. Okay, so negative feedback is often the basis of error detection, which leads to error correction. Let's look at some questions. Practice questions. Let's see. Let me go up here. Okay, so what have we got here on this first question? Explain why. Well, we already know this is going to be because. We already know this is going to be this means, or it's going to be therefore. This is the key language we're going to use when we're explaining why. Explain why extrinsic feedback is particularly important to Joe as he learns the tennis serve. So why is it necessary for him to get extrinsic feedback? Let's have a look. This is because, notice the skill, Joe needs high quality information from an outside source. Because he does not yet have the intrinsic feeling of the correct skill. Therefore, Joe needs coaching points. There's my 3 marks. Okay, I'm saying why. I'm not really describing the idea of extrinsic feedback in a lot of detail. I'm using some of the key descriptors, but I'm using it with an explanatory this is because structure. Okay, and that's what you guys need to get in the habit of doing. Okay, if you're asked to explain why, you must explain why. Next question, explain how. When we explain how, we're typically using language such as it happens through or it happens by things. Through and by is classic explaining how language. Explain how Joe's coach could use both positive and negative feedback to help Joe learn the tennis serve techniques. We're still on the serve. Explain how. Let's have a little look at it. Let me just make my layers available to me. Joe's coach could use positive feedback by, note my language, explaining how, by stating what was correct or using praise. So I'm saying either praise, which is emotion-based, or stating what was correct, which is technique-based. I might get 2 marks for that and get a submax. Now, there's only no marks available to me for talking about negative feedback because I've already got 2 for positive. This means Joe is more motivated to repeat the correct action. So maybe I would have got a mark for motivated, but I'm not getting that because I have to talk about negative. What have we got next? The coach will use negative feedback for error detection. Okay? And to create an improvement plan. And therefore, we've got our max. We've got our 3 in there. I've talked about positive. I've talked about negative. I've clearly explained how. Beautiful. Again, you're probably going to need to revisit these questions in a bit more time and a bit more detail outside of this live experience if you're on the live show, okay? If you're doing this on demand, you can pause and take the answers in. You can, by the way, feel free to try and improve them. There's probably loads of improvements that could be made. These are just my versions, right? Using specific examples, so I must explain how. So again, I'm going to use through, by, explain how Joe and his coach could use KOP to improve Joe's tennis serving technique. So we're interested in knowledge of performance. Let's have a look. Joe's coach will use KOP by informing Joe that your elbow angle was perfect that time. Okay, so there's my example. It's information-based, it's knowledge of performance, it's technique-based. This means Joe received technique-based information. Joe will use KOP by assessing performance indicators as well as the intrinsic feeling of the skill. And there I get my max. Okay, so I'm clearly showing my explain how skill. I'm saying through by. I'm clearly talking about knowledge of performance. I'm using my key language within my answer, and therefore I'm explaining how, with specific examples, how KOP could be used by Joe and I guess potentially the coach and association to improve the tennis serving technique. So really important stuff, guys. For me, the knowledge is relatively straightforward. What I would encourage you lot to think about is the skills that I've just represented and how to get that knowledge into the correct structure on these questions.
Do we now have good sound?
Yes, we do have good sound now.
It always helps if I turn the volume up twice in one day. Good. Questions?
I've got one. Question is, if it's not my specification and I talk about it, can I get marks?
I think I can only answer that question as no. You get some of the, as I mentioned there, you get some of these things that kind of overlap, some stuff like concurrent knowledge of performance, but I certainly can't sit here and tell you that if you only have knowledge of performance on your course, like who's that, like WJC, that concurrent is going to be part of the mark scheme. So I don't know that. So I think I have to answer the question as no. Although I think it's theoretically possible that you would, I'd have to answer the question as no. No, you should stick with the knowledge that's relevant. In this case, look, obviously it's not bad to learn more rather than less. It's nice. But a couple of days out from your exam, my answer is no.
Okay. And going back to the content of what you've just been explaining, can you have, what's it called, knowledge of results during a performance?
That one depends very much on how you define the performance. So, for example, let's take, I think I talked a couple of times about basketball. Let's take a basketball guard or a forward or whatever, strong forward, whatever position. That player, when they shoot at the basket, gets knowledge of results of whether the ball goes in or not, and you can make an argument that that is within the performance, that is concurrent, that is not, that is during the performance. However, what we tend to do is the trick there is we tend to look at the shot as like a discrete element all on its own and a performance all on its own. So that element has finished. So that's still knowledge of results. So on that one, I think it's how the question's written. If it says in a basketball match, then yes, you get a knowledge of results during the performance because it's whether the ball goes in. Did I prevent my opposition player passing me on my right hand side? These are knowledge of results. But of course, each of those elements is like a chunk that happens and then ends, happens and ends, happens and ends. So I would still argue that they're at the end of performance. They're just not at the end of the match. So it depends how you look at that one.
Brilliant. And
Thanks.
And could you please give me an example of when KOP is really positive, but KOR is really negative?
Okay, all right, that's interesting. So, what would be a classic example of that? That basically means knowledge of results is bad, like we lost, but the knowledge of performance, my performance level was high. So I would say a classic example of that, I'm sure people out who are taking the session will have experienced this. I would say a classic example of that is something like, let's say you're playing in a youth league for a team sport like football or rugby or whatever, and you're in, say, the under-18s, and your entire squad is 16 years old, and you're 2 years from the maximum age of that kind of division. Okay, it's quite likely that you're going to get really good performance quality out if you're doing the right things, like any team can, but you're still going to lose a lot of games because the other teams are going to be physically more superior to you because they're potentially 2 years older. So that's one of the classic cases where the knowledge of performance, the KOP, could be really, really positive, really, really high, but you're still going to get results which are negative. In other words, that you're going to get losses. Just don't forget that KOR can be something much less than winning and losing. It can be, did the ball go in or not? Did I make a successful pass? Did the pass get to my receiver or not? You can break it down into those elements as well. But that would be a classic example. And it touches on the idea that if you think about sport at a more macro level, the one thing you're not in control of is the outcome. So most of the time, performers are in control of the performance quality that they exhibit. How well did I play today? How well did I run? What was my time? What was my height? What was my distance? All this kind of stuff. So let me rephrase that. How well did I play today? How well did my strategy work alongside my partner? These sorts of things are controllable by the individual. Did I win or lose? Knowledge of results, the outcome. You could play your best performance ever and still lose heavily because the opponent does it even better. And that, of course, is why knowledge of results is a very limited thing to judge yourself on. If you only judge yourself by winning and losing, sport by its nature means that we tend to win less than 50% of the time, and that's in things like team games. If you look at things like athletics, swimming, that kind of thing, we tend to lose far more often statistically across the whole range of performers than we do to win. So therefore, knowledge of performance tends to be a much richer vein of information about improvement and gain moving forward, whereas knowledge of results tends to be summative. Did I win or lose? Did the ball go in or out? Did I score or not? These tend to be sort of summary things that we can build, but we need that performance information to get the big picture to improve. I'm banging on, I'll shut up.
It's all right, brilliant. I've got one last question.
Mm-hmm.
Just comment. Is terminal feedback synonymous with KOR?
They're closely related, yes. I wouldn't say they're the same thing, but they're very, very closely related. One of the ways we would describe knowledge of results is that it's terminal. It happens at the end of performance because you have to have the result, and therefore it has to be terminal. It comes back to the first question you asked, which was, can knowledge of results be during performance? Well, it can be during a match or a competition, but it's at the end of that element. So effectively, yes. Terminal just means the end, right? Terminal just means the finish, the end point, and results means the finish, the end point, what comes out of it. So yeah.
So is it the case where maybe KOR is a type of terminal feedback, but it or would be a terminal feedback, but it's not the only?
Yeah, I think you've got to come back to the exam board structures here. Some of them say terminal concurrent, some of them say KOP and KOR. You just got to use the term which relates to your exam board. They're they're very, very similar concepts, but you have to use them in relation to what's expected of you in this course, which I go back to what I said before of all that madness with different exam boards, you expecting you to know different ones and not others. So you guys obviously need to be sensitive to that. So yeah, so that's that. Any other things?
Nope.
So really that just leaves me to say to you guys out there, firstly to teachers, thank you ever so much for supporting us on this journey. I think you're going to find it interesting what we have planned in the coming weeks. We have a gigantic series of announcements that we're going to make in the coming days. I think you're going to be intrigued. To students out there, obviously, push yourselves these next few days. Keep thinking in that positive frame. Think about that positive self-talk in relation to your preparation for your exams. Yes, you need to have the skill. Yes, you need to have the knowledge, but a positive frame of mind will also support you in getting the best quality information down on those pieces of paper. Just a reminder what I said before, we are going to have that content-only video that will be available imminently after the show, so I encourage you to check that. And just a massive thank you to you students. We really do appreciate that you listen to me, and we really do appreciate that I get the opportunity to teach you things. It means a lot to me on a personal level, and I wish you the very best for the coming days, weeks, and also for the longer term future. Take care, guys. All the best. Look after yourselves.
The traditional classroom environment doesn't suit everyone. Students that don't fit this pace of learning begin to lose confidence. The problem is, the current learning model has holes in it. Luckily, the EverLearner.com is here to fill those holes. With the EverLearner Classroom, each student is given a chance to master each subject at their own pace. With thousands of video tutorials and tens of thousands of automated questions on the site, students can progress at their own individual pace. And because every interaction is tracked within the site, teachers can review students' progress and gain access to razor-sharp data. Teachers will have more time to engage with small groups and be better informed of where their time and support is needed. With the EverLearner, teachers can leave the traditional model behind and become facilitators, coaches, and inspirers. There's a reason we have over 100,000 registered students. To learn more, visit our website today.
Takes two.